Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Welcome to another edition of Sci-Fi in the post-pandemic world. So we are mostly connecting online instead of the physical meetings that we were used to all these years at Sci-Fi. And today we've gathered with a very distinguished panel to talk about the internet and how democratic norms, which in many ways shaped the internet, is now looking at becoming an authoritarian internet. And even while there are the usual suspects which have tried to create big national firewalls around their internet, we also have many democratic countries now in some ways looking at making their internet much more authoritarian than what it was originally envisaged. And to discuss this with me is a very distinguished panel. With me, I have Lindsay Gorman. She's a senior policy advisor of technology strategy at the White House. Chitra Subramaniam, she's a very distinguished journalist, very well known in India and abroad, and she's currently the founder of CSD Consulting. Dennis Broders from Leiden University. He's a professor of global security and technology and senior fellow at the Hague Program for Cyber Norms at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs of Leiden University. Fergus Hansen, Director, International Cyber Policy at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Thorsten Wensing, Project Director of the Digital Rights, Surveillance and Democracy. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. I'll request each one of you to spend about 2 minutes each with some opening remarks, and then we'll try and tackle some of more specific issues. And one thing that I would be very keen on is that based on your current location and how you're looking at global affairs, if you could also come up with some kind of possible solutions that we could achieve not only at our national level, but also as multilateral in a globalized world, how can we come together and address some of these issues? So with that, I think I'll start with Dennis. If you would like to take off, Dennis, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Sad that we couldn't join in New Delhi. It's always nice to be at Sci-Fi in real life. So we have three sort of guiding questions, sort of scanning the horizon of the topic, sort of digital democracy versus digital authoritarianism. And the first thing that sort of came to my mind when I looked at it was sort of the difference, sort of question about the difference between digital authoritarianism and digital democracy. And the difference is mostly not so much in the digital, but the difference is mostly in the mindset, right? So you have a very different way of looking at the world in a democracy than you have in a more authoritarian country. And then the digital becomes the means, but the means are quite impressive in this case, right? So if you have a more authoritarian outlook, you're looking to limit voice of people who do not agree with you. You're probably looking to limit diversity in speech anyway. You're trying to amplify your own narrative, and you're interested in surveillance probably, right? And all of those are extremely well catered by sort of the digital world we have created for ourselves. So the political outlook is first, but then given the fact that we have digitized to the degree we have, and obviously that varies around the globe, we have created an infrastructure basically that is very well suited for authoritarianism. To go to sort of a second level, which is also in the questions, is okay, so how does this sort of rise, if we can talk about a rise of digital authoritarianism, how does it tap into sort of democracies? And I think one thing, I work for a program called the Hague Program for Cyber Norms, so one of the things I do there is look at sort of the international multilateral processes, UN processes on these on sort of international cybersecurity governance. And one of the things you see there is that traditionally, that's sort of the authoritarian countries, sort of spearheaded by China and Russia. They were always keen to talk about information security. They always wanted to talk about information security with a view to how can we, from their view, protect our national infosphere, and how can we make sure that we have regime continuity, etc. Western countries were always sort of standoffish for that. They always said, no, we would like to talk about cybersecurity. We do not want to talk about information security. That is slowly starting to tilt, and that is development that we have to be really careful with. So with the rise of disinformation, with the rise of fake news, with the rise of active measures, with the rise of foreign intelligence, sort of stoking up debate in different countries, more and more you see that Western countries or democratic countries are also starting to worry about their national infosphere, are also starting to think maybe we should be addressing these things too. And now we're suddenly finding democratic countries slightly on the back foot because they have to engage with a debate that's been framed by the others basically for a very long time, but they feel they have to move forward on it. They're talking about information security in a sense. I was surprised, but it's still in there. In the last UNGG report that was adopted in 2021, in the threat section, it says states are worried about information operations for the first time. That is only a line in a report of the UN that hasn't even adopted by the UN General Assembly yet, but still, it is something that they fought tooth and nail to keep out for a really long time. So that's interesting. Also, you see in various degrees in Western countries that they start regulating technology companies to see what they need to do there. So that's interesting too. Do I have time to go into the third question, or shall I yield to others?
I'll move on to the others because we just have 2 minutes for each opening remarks. And with that, I'll come to you, Lindsay. Dennis sort of has set the ball rolling in terms of how now Western democracies are also talking a language which they had opposed all these years. So where would you like to come in on this shift that we are seeing globally?
First of all, thank you so much to the moderator, to my fellow panelists, to Sci-Fi for organizing it and the invitation to speak here today. It's really a pleasure to be with you all across these time zones and across this new pandemic environment. I'd like to keep my opening remarks to focus on really situating the moment that we're in a bit of a historical context over the last 20 to 30 years of sort of how we got to where we are today. And perhaps where we can go forward. And I think we were at a place where the early internet was filled with this incredible unbridled optimism for democracies. That in this era, in the late 80s, the early 90s, there was this thinking and not unfounded ideas that the internet itself would usher in an age of new democracy, that these technologies that were just springing up, aided by the proliferation of the internet, would inherently favor democracy, would be liberalizing by their very nature. The internet emerged as this ultimate connector around the time that the Berlin Wall fell, aided by radio and communications, and promised to be this ultimate democratizing force by increasing access to information globally. But I think we failed to see that just as democracies were riding this wave of optimism and promise for this new internet era, autocracies recognized and perhaps even feared that these technologies would be used to undermine autocratic governance and began ambitious projects to make the internet work for autocracy. And I think today, we are seeing the fruits of those experiments come to life. According to Freedom House, the internet freedom has declined for each year of the last decade. Internet shutdowns are being used as a tool of political suppression, and surveillance technologies and digital authoritarianism, as this panel seeks to grapple with, are on the rise. And what that means is that democracies really need to work harder to ensure that the technologies we're developing and promoting have our values at their core. And I think really the question is for us today, and one of the reasons that I think it's so important that we are joining here from across these time zones and from many different countries, is to contemplate what is this next turn of the digital revolution that as democracies we would like to engineer. How can we imbue it with our shared democratic values of openness and accountability and trust and interoperability to ensure that not only the future of the internet that we're building today, but actually also the technologies that go on top of that internet are reflective of our shared values. And what that means, 20, 30, 35, 40, even 50 years out, from that early internet era.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'll come to you now, Chitra. You've been a celebrated journalist. You've exposed high corruption, and you're no stranger to governments not being very happy with what you reported and exposed. Did you see this shift? If you could come in.
Yeah. Okay. Just to say thank you for inviting me into this panel. And, I take yes to what has been said before me, but I think it was coming. We should have seen this coming, because also I think I'm a little fortunate because I live in a very technology type of environment. And I see things happening every day, and it's part of my job is to connect the dots. So to come back to Lindsay's comments about about the sudden arrival of internet for everybody, or the comment before was it broad? Was it? Sorry, I can't see your name. Denny. As I was preparing for this thing, the first, and this is, I live in Geneva, and we've seen this. The WTO talks completely come unstuck on patents and on essential drugs. Now you're talking about the vaccines, but I was thinking, so who is to call the shots? I mean, where does this power reside? And it occurred to me as I was preparing for this conversation that I think all these companies, we talk about the GAFA, we talk about smaller companies, because you see, what are we looking at? We're looking at five, whether democratic or not, and they can, they are unelected, they're unaccountable, and so who would be this thing or even an entity that would come and call for rules? Were we to say, okay, the governments are doing this, the governments are doing that, but who do we go to as users? And I think the user perspective is very important to keep, because at the end of the day, we are all the users. Either you use them for AI or use them for medical reasons, or we're users of technology. And independent of what we want or don't, these technologies are pushing us, to a society. And just to come back, I think that the New World Order, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think there was chaos, complete chaos. When you see, and then you see how the NATO was completely irrelevant since then, after that, because you had you already had China, Russia. China we didn't know anything about, but the Western world chose not to see. China was buying up stuff. China was becoming a global power. And today China is everywhere. Whether we like it or not, they're everywhere. And the pandemic showed them up, showed the power they have. And I could talk. I mean, I could go on and on. But these would be my. I mean, how many of us were actually sleeping, and how many of us were sleeping with our eyes open? This is the question that I would like to pose to this panel and beyond.
Thank you so much, Chitra. For this, I'll come to you. We've heard what Chitra said, and she's talking about where do we go as users. And if you see the last decade as ICANN moved, where we looked at how do we govern the internet, and there's been questions about how some countries are pushing for a multilateral forum, and then we said, no, we need a multi-stakeholder forum for governing the internet. And that could have possibly led to the answer that where do users go? But however, we continue to see that really hasn't been the case. So if we could hear your opening remarks on this shift that we are looking at.
Well, thank you. First of all, just thank you so much for inviting me along today. It's a real pleasure to be joining you from Australia. To me, the big shift that we're seeing now is the heightened competition between authoritarianism and democracies. And at the very heart of that competition is, as Lindsay said, is values. The key thing that distinguishes democracies from authoritarian states is the values, and that's the attractive power of democracies, the rights and freedoms that you gain as a citizen living inside a democracy. And to me, we've had this period where we've, I think, a little bit lazily in the West, adopted lots of technologies because they might have been convenient, or we haven't really thought too much about the values that underpin those technologies. And surveillance technologies are a good example where they superficially offer some really a lot of convenience, for example, to law enforcement. But if you don't bake in values and think really carefully about the controls and the limits that you're going to place on those sort of technologies, then I think you very quickly end up undermining your democratic society. So to me, it's this competition is leading to a bifurcation in technology, and we're going to have two different classes of technology, but increasingly there'll be a focus on the values that are baked into those technologies, and I think there'll be a greater consciousness amongst governments and enterprise and individuals in thinking through the technologies that they're going to use in their societies and the values that are baked into them.
Constance, you've seen a lot of work around this, and you've seen how the technology has shifted very dramatically. From what I'm hearing from others, it doesn't seem like a very new thing. We've seen similar kind of technologies being subverted and more surveillance, more authoritarianism, even in democratic countries. How would you see this transition?
Thank you. Also from my side, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to this year's Sci-Fi. Exactly what has been said by some here in the panel already. When I thought of the initial question about distinguishing between digital democracy and digital authoritarianism, I found it quite easy, so to speak, to identify what digital authoritarianism might look like, but I found it much harder to really speak of digital democracy and what that could mean. And I give you maybe a distinction that is helpful for the further discussions, because in a place branded digital authoritarianism, you would find unconstrained, unregulated, disproportionate government access to personal data. And the legal framework that is in place might have seen some reforms, but you can go down to the different criteria that who has made this legal framework, what are the conditions, what are the definitions for access that are being held. But then also you come down to the decision of for what aims should such access be used. Could it be just for the welfare of everybody, or should it be strictly for when it's really strictly necessary for the democracy? And you have lots of other criteria, right? So the design of oversight and accountability and giving people redress once they have their rights have been infringed and the like. And that is different, luckily, to some extent in our liberal democracies, where we feel some of the practices we see in authoritarian regimes, they may still look like taking from pages of a dystopian model, but it's not to say that we don't have challenges, right? And that we have not work in progress. And that's two things I just want to, at the opening, want to throw in here, is that when it comes to our own discussion on how to use rapidly evolving information technologies, we also see that our legal frameworks are lagging behind, that the use of technologies, new surveillance, bulk hacking, government computer network exploitation, how's it regulated? Do you have good rules and law, good regulations in place for the collection of information, but does that extend also to how the data is then being used? And do you have different laws in place for different actors in the security sector, say military, police, intelligence? And to what extent do the oversight bodies really have an overview of such data collection and data use? And do they use the latest technology? So there are lots of open questions when it comes to how good are we when it comes to securing that government access to personal data, often held by the private sector, is proportionate. And some courts have found that there are question marks that can be raised, and that again is a sign of democratic practice, because you have a lot more stakeholders who are invited to contest and pursue litigation or active forms of civil information and the like. So that is actually a good sign that things are evolving, to my understanding. And then lastly, if you allow me that point, is also, a number of actors, especially in the private sector, are taking decision in our democracies that deeply affect the way we live our lives. Just to give you an example, recently here in Germany was the question of YouTube's takedown of Russia Today video clips from Germany, and no question in my mind that there can be lots of information or misinformation in such video clippings, but the question remains, how much power do we want to give to such platforms, and to what extent can we rely on there being due process and lots of good decisions being made that you would expect from the government, that to some extent maybe we don't have covered this in the private sector as much. So that with that, I just felt like the dichotomy isn't as easy to draw as we may hope.
In fact, I'll now go back. I'll come to all of you with questions in the reverse order that we just had for the opening remarks. And my first question to you, of course, is, Thorsten, is you very succinctly put out that the dichotomies are not as clearly as we see, but we are also seeing that this, and this is something our other panelist has also pointed out, democracies or established Western democracies, which were supposed to be at the vanguard or at the forefront of protecting these ideals, they themselves have started muddying the waters. And as I think Dennis also pointed out, that we've moved from an era where earlier they would say cybersecurity, now they want to talk about information security. And most of these triggers come from their understanding and concept of national security. And therefore they add more surveillance, they add more control of data, more access to citizens' data, and the lines are blurring. So is this change in a way permanent, or is this reversible?
Thanks. To be honest, I mean, this is a huge question that you can break down to different fields and how that applied to that field. But in a sense, I was hoping to portray the message that, our democracies have taken centuries to come to where they are with some of the protections and safeguards. And of course, there is ubiquitous efforts to trim such safeguards, and to maybe also say, look, we can't, security threats are real and have to be addressed, and I'm not denying that. But of course, there is a body of knowledge that exists in our democracies that you can bring to the digital sphere, where you think, okay, let's not rush necessarily into changing the legal frameworks all so rapidly. We have, established, for instance, the notion that there can't be general warrants. There can't be. You need to give those who have then access to very sensitive information. They should be in a position of responsibility, and they should know that this takes sometimes just a click to share that with other partners, and this grows a lot of challenges. But what I also want to stress is that I find with things evolving so rapidly, there is capacity building that took place in civil society that wasn't, sometimes they were just lagging behind. They didn't understand so deeply what the legal framework entails. And it was at one point probably very comfortable to live in a situation where half of the stakeholders, the individual, but also people in universities and in the private sector, were maybe not in a position to really understand the complexity of some of the technological changes. But we live in a free society, and there are more and more fora and catching up taking place. So you can see also a bit of a counterweight, right? I spoke to litigation that in some Western democracies has also led to some developments to be reversed. And there's also the idea of export of surveillance technology, and you realize that states have taken a long time to understand what is actually at risk and what technology may not be exported. And but then, you hear recently new voices also from government that take their responsibility seriously and that they have learned in dialogue with civil society. And that is, for me, one of the key things to bear in mind, that if you, as an open society, as these technological developments, they really tear at the social fabric if they are unaccounted for, and therefore you need to be in constant dialogue and open discussions. And yeah, so that partly answers your question, I hope.
Thank you. For this, I'll come to you. In Australia, you've seen a lot of debates around, say, the Solar Law, which talks about more access, giving the government more power to access information. And in fact, the Australian Parliamentary Committee on Security and Intelligence has also come up with a report. There's a lot of concern. Tech companies have also issued certain worries about how this could impact the work and the way people access the internet. Now, Australia is very much part of the democratic setup that has been pushing for greater freedom. And yet we see something like this happening. But on the other hand, and ASPI's done a great report earlier when we saw the Russians interfere in the American elections. So how do we find this balance and ensure that the ideals we keep holding up, which shapes a democratic internet, does not get diluted towards, even in countries which are outwardly democratic, getting impacted by a more authoritarian version?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good and a tough question. I think what Torsten was saying around, the process that it's taken democracies to incrementally build up these checks and balances in their system is something that we're going through in a rapid process now with the rollout of new technologies, and we haven't got all of the answers, I think, and we're sort of making this up as we go along. But I think the key advantage that democracies have over authoritarian states is that we have elected representatives who are, representing us and trying to make these arbitrations on each of these decisions as we go along. So that's the advantage we've got. One of the mistakes I think we make in the big picture is to sort of think, well, we had this utopian idea about a free, and freewheeling internet that was going to be this perfect place. It sort of assumed that there would, I think, a level of maturity that societies everywhere just do not have. And it also enables the small number of people who are, using it maliciously or being offensive online or doing things that are terrible to be, to amplify their voices through automation technologies and to find each other and form these little clusters that makes them more powerful than they might have been otherwise. So I think the challenge we've got is to not sort of think, well, just because the utopian vision of the internet didn't work out, that therefore the authoritarian model is the one that is the right answer. I think that's not the case at all. What we've really got to do is incrementally work out how we can apply and arbitrate different circumstances as democracies and say, well, that behavior is okay, that behavior is not okay. And the acts that you mentioned in Australia, I think there was, that's an open question. Was that a legitimate measure for a democracy to take? Democracies have decided that, you should be able to have lawful access under warrant to, for example, with telecommunications. What's the online version of that, and how do you negotiate with tech platforms to enable some version of that? Now, I think that's a very legitimate open question for civil society and others and tech companies and governments to have. I'm not pretending Australia's got the right answer on all these things, but I think it's more about that give and take that democracies have got to come to, rather than sort of being prescriptive and saying it's either the utopian vision or the authoritarian model.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dennis, you've seen the rise, among other things, like most technologies, the rise of cyber terrorism. You've seen how China is now shaping the internet, and even the private companies, and we've seen actually a much bigger control under the current regime in Beijing on these technology companies, and how they are using those companies as well as a means of their national security to an extent, and also to have a global footprint, etc. What lies for the internet in such a scenario?
I'm glad you mentioned the companies again, because it's one of the threads throughout this whole conversation. And if I have to pick out two, it's the corporations, and the other one that gets mentioned a lot is sort of public goals and public values, right? So how do you, in a situation where so much of sort of our digital political life is sort of channeled through these corporations, then how do we deal with this corporation? Chitra talked about how to hold them accountable, how do we see towards users. Torsten talked about regulation, for example. So there's a lot there to unpack. I really agree with Fergus that we shouldn't be bound by sort of by the ideal type, by the utopia, right? Let's step away from utopia. We know from all these 100 years of democracy is messy too, right? So we need to embellish that. It's an ideal that is great, but practice is more difficult. So if you look at, I think if you look at governments, for example, so governments, both politically and as a regulatory, there is a lot of work to be done, right? So we also need to look in the mirror. If we look at what is going on in that infosphere now, we see a lot of political vandalism, political behavior that is not good for democracy, and that is undercutting it to a certain extent. So a lot of it starts at home, right? That's one. The other thing is what Torsten said about regulation, right? So, or what Chitra called sort of deepening. So how far do you go? You have all these possibilities. David Lyon, a famous sociologist of surveillance, said, so any surveillance system is anywhere between care and control. You want to organize a welfare state, you need registrations. You want to suppress the people, you need even more registrations. So we're always somewhere on that continuum, and which point do we pick? And then we come to what is one of the crux questions, I think, is, okay, if these corporations are so important, and we're talking about safeguarding public values, then we need to realize that they do not have public values. They have private values. That does not mean that there can't be any alignment, but it means that in the end, they serve different needs. They serve shareholders, they serve different things. So it's not a natural given that they will align with public values. They have markets to capture. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. So they will sort of ply towards what is happening. And also, in their business model, and we're talking about especially social media corporations, their business model is built on the whole idea of surveillance. Their business model is built on the fact that we track and trace everything. And we do this to sell advertising, but the technology is being developed. The technology spreads throughout the system. So you're going to see it pop up elsewhere too. So how do we hold private companies to account that operate globally, right? They are organizing a large chunk of the way we see the world. How do we hold them to account? Is international law, does it have an answer? No, not at all, nothing. International companies do not exist in international law. So where do we start? Users would be great, and sometimes when they really misbehave, you can do something, but usually they're really well equipped to sort of hide all their decisions under a big mantle of consensus and different other things. So it's very hard for users to step up too. Politicians, perhaps then, national legislation, who's going to curtail their champions in order to sort of support the global public good? It would be nice. Maybe that's the way to look at it, but I don't see an easy answer yet. So do we go faster, do we go deeper? I think a few things of the democratic answers I heard here today is sort of a role of independent media, sort of, I would say also within government, the role of the judges, but they need to be better equipped. Judges are the slow brakes of the system. They can look much more toward public values and perhaps do something good there, but they need to be equipped to do this. And at some point, and I'm far from saying it's perfect, we also as governance at some point need to push back against the power of these companies. And for example, now you have the debate in the EU about the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act. Nowhere near perfect, but there is an idea behind it that also taps into what we're talking about here about public values and how to behave for these corporations. So I'll leave it at that.
So also, like for example, how the internet is shaped. Like we saw the GDPR actually giving a lot of hope across the globe about how to push back on certain aspects on limiting government's access to data or also that of corporations. And I think it's done more good than bad, for sure. So can we see similar kind of things reinforcing the democratic principles of the internet?
Maybe, but the interesting thing is, so part of it goes to the values, part of it goes to the regulatory aspect of it. Part of it also has to do with the stick, right? There's a reason why under competition policy, at first we use competition policy to deal with media, social media companies, because it was the only thing that carried the stick. It was, now we have GDPR. Now we saw, what was it? Luxembourg, of all member states, fining one of the big media companies 650 million, right? That is a new thing, it's a new development. And I think that is something, it doesn't necessarily change everything, because these companies have extremely deep pockets, and the court cases drag out, and by the time they have to pay, it's already been sidelined for them. But it does perhaps change the conversation. It does mean perhaps that these companies will pick up the phone when certain legislators call and ask for things. So I wish Speak Softly would carry the day, but carrying a big stick also seems to be quite important. And I think we're sort of slowly starting to realize that a lot of governments are starting to realize, oh, hang on, these are really impressive globally operating companies, but we're still states. This is still a sovereign state. We still have something to say here. We still have something to say about the way our national infosphere is being organized. But that also entices, and then we're back where we began, that also means you're gonna interfere to a certain extent in content, so it brings also a lot of other problematic discussions on board. But perhaps democracies should at least be better equipped to deal with those, but we shall see.
Thank you so much. Since we are closing, we're about to end, I'll request all of you with some closing comments, but also and take this conversation forward. But Thorsten, I think you wanted to come in and make a point.
Thanks, and I can combine that with my closing statement if you like to make that quicker. But it's just from listening what Dennis also said. I think it's so important to understand that, you know, democracies, as you said, is a messy business too, and we have lots of challenges to address. And when we do so, we have to be mindful that there's a difference between some provisions on the books and practice on the ground. And, you know, media, investigative journalists have a key role to play in to making the difference clearer. But then again, as you know, some humbleness to just say, look, we're facing big challenges, and I can list a number of regions where we, you know, policy and law is very much frontier territory, even in the US and in Europe and in other democracies, and therefore to have an openness, that's the one thing, to comparative research where you think, you know, a lot of democracies are facing, despite all their constitutional differences, very similar challenges, and it is actually quite a fruitful endeavor to look at how some have addressed this with giving more thought to, you know, the informational self-determination or press freedom or privacy than others may have done. And the second point and the last point I want to make is that, of course, when it comes to trust in the media, that's one thing, but, you know, there are lots of oversight bodies, and we should probably do more to call for enhanced accountability or oversight reporting, right? So what access do they have, and if and all do they make use of supervisory technology? Because if they have access, you can get a lot of you can use machine learning not just for the provision of security, you can use machine learning for justice, for oversight, and for a number of other goals. And there, I think, is also some public money that needs to be put to make those oversight bodies more fit for purpose. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but I'll quickly add that it's been such a pleasure hearing each one of you. And thank you so much for such a thoughtful interventions and discussions from all of you. And hopefully, I mean, if you look at it, when the printing press came, when it was invented, it created shockwaves around the world, but reading has never been a bad idea. And I think the balance is very clearly that more knowledge disseminated to as many people has always been good. And as Marshall McLuhan said, the speed at which information travels will also have an impact, and the internet has clearly posed those challenges. But I think as representatives and members of democratic societies and communities, we will continue to have a coalition. As Chitra also pointed out, we'll continue to work together and keep these principles high and flying. And hopefully we'll continue to see a more decisive shift towards a democratic internet. Thank you so much. And again, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to wherever you are. and may you have a great week.
Thank you. Thanks, people.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.